Okay, so now that we're recording, officially welcome to our December webinar. Since this is the end of the year and this is the last webinar in the year, we're going to have hopefully a shorter and more concise one. Um, and then in January, we'll start with something bigger. It's simply due to the holidays that everyone is busy and there's a lot of stuff to do. I would want to try and still be informative, but also not take up 2.5 hours of your time as we sometimes do. As I go through the presentation, as always, use the Q&A option to ask you any questions that you may have. I'll keep it open in the corner of my screen because these buttons today, I don't know what is happening with Zoom, but they work and don't work half of the time. This way, I'll make sure that I can see all the questions. So let's get started. This is what we will be talking about today. So the topic is ADHD and skin picking, and we'll talk about statistics, those related to ADHD, those related to picking, and what we know about the overlap between the two. We'll talk about different types of ADHD and how it's typically diagnosed, what criteria are used. We'll then discuss how these different symptoms of ADHD can lead to skin picking. And there will be a short section in the end that will talk about problems. I should have put that here. Problems that ADHD poses for the treatment of skin picking or for psychotherapy as such. And then we will briefly discuss medication for ADHD and the very conflicting relationship they appear to have with skin picking. And then, of course, in the end, we'll do our Q&A. Just like last month, we will not be recording the Q&A. People have emailed me saying that they felt more comfortable sharing more intimate details. So we'll try it this way one more time and see what works best for all of you. I've also started the poll so that you can choose the topic for next month. So please make sure to vote so that your topic gets chosen. So let's start with the webinar finally. So here on the right, you see a snapshot of a study called Prevalence of Skin Picking, skin picking or excoriation disorder by Professor Grant. He is a major name in BFRB research. This is a study that was done on over 10,000 adults, ages from 18 to 69. So it's quite a big sample of people. And the idea was to determine the prevalence of skin picking in the general population. 2.1% identified skin picking as a problem that they're currently having. And then 3.1 reported skin picking as a lifetime problem. So something that has occurred and has been occurring for a long time, or they've had an episode of skin picking. So in that sense, when you look at these numbers, I don't know sort of if they seem high to you or not, but for a mental health problem, these are quite high numbers. Just to give you an example, schizophrenia, which is much more researched and better known and more talked about, I believe the prevalence is about 1 in 1,000, whereas 2.1 is 2 in 100. So 1 in every 50 people that you know probably struggles with skin picking. So it's quite common, and it's more common than it is known as a psychological issue. Somewhat more than half of those who reported struggling with skin picking were female. So before, like maybe 7-8 years ago, I've seen studies that would disproportionately say that women are more affected with body-focused repetitive behaviors. But it turns out that the issue that this was mainly just skewed perception because women were more likely to seek help or talk about it. So in that sense, men and their problems with BFRBs were somewhat underreported. But here we see that in this specific study, you can find the whole study online for free, which is why I left you a screenshot here. If you can't find it, I can send you a PDF. So it's freely available. I'll download it for you. In this study specifically, I believe about 54 or 55% of those who said that they struggle with skin picking were women. So this is as far as skin picking goes. So 3.1% as a lifetime problem is not low at all. Now let's look at ADHD and see what are the chances that they will overlap. This is from the National Institute of Mental Health. You can see their icon or logo or whatever it is here on the upper right corner. This is a graph that shows trends in prevalence of children who were diagnosed with ADHD. So these 3 points show data from 2003, data from 2007, and data from 2011. As you can see, the prevalence keeps growing steadily. Unfortunately, we don't have this type of information for skin picking or for hair pulling, indeed. So for none of the BFRBs, but for ADHD, we do, because it is much more, it's researched much more. So even in 2003, these numbers are quite high. So the dark line, the first dark line in dark blue, is male population. The lower line, the light blue one, is female, and then the middle line is just the total population average prevalence. So it went up from 7.8 on average to 11 in 2011. So this is the data that they posted. I'm sure that there are studies, and I'm pretty sure that this trend has perhaps stagnated or even grown, but I suspect that it hasn't dropped. Why this keeps happening is really not that clear. One part of that appears to be that it's simply paid attention to a little more. People are being more mindful of ADHD, so they seek help more frequently, and then more people are diagnosed. It could be because it's misdiagnosed or overdiagnosed. This is also an issue, and there has been quite a bit of debate in mental health circles surrounding this issue. So there are many ways to explain why this is happening, but the core of it is that the prevalence of ADHD is almost 4 times higher than that of skin picking. However, when you take a look at people who have both, you will find that it's not that rare at all to have both. So if Zoom would just kindly switch, oh, here it is. So this is a study again by John Grant. It's called Characteristics of 262 Adults with Skin Picking Disorder. So they analyzed in different ways 262 adults who struggle with skin picking. They analyzed their gender, age, education, what parts of their body they pick from, what triggers them, all kinds of things. It's a very interesting paper. Another one that you can find on PubMed if you want to read. This table is taken from that paper, and it shows psychiatric disorders that tend to occur together with skin picking. So here we see that the most common comorbidity, so co-occurring condition, is trichotillomania. Around every 4th person that picks their skin also pulls their hair. Then it's depression, then generalized anxiety disorder, and then in the 4th place, it's ADHD with 8%. So 8% of people, at least according to this study, 8% of people who struggle with skin picking, they also have ADHD diagnosed. Now, the fact that these two occur together doesn't mean that one causes the other. So it could be just a correlation, meaning that 2 variables change, but they're not necessarily in a similar way, but it doesn't mean that they're necessarily causally connected. So I don't think it's fair to say that skin picking causes ADHD or that ADHD causes skin picking. However, the case that I will try to make here is that ADHD sometimes makes skin picking worse, that sometimes skin picking is a way to cope with certain side effects, take that under quotation marks, with certain symptoms of ADHD. And then I will make the case that ADHD can make treating skin picking more complicated, and that it can exacerbate existing skin picking. So even if they're not connected causally, they do affect each other. So they feed into each other. In this case in particular, since our main focus here is skin picking, we will talk about how ADHD affects skin picking. I was looking for studies that investigated this in more detail, and I'm sure it will come as no surprise that I didn't find any. I think I did a pretty thorough search, but if you're aware of some studies that actually deal with these two, not case reports, I will show you resources for that as well. But actual studies, I would really be curious to read them, because I wasn't able to find almost anything. So we will rely on case reports, we will rely on clinical experience and the stories of clients that I hear or read or listen to every day. So that's what we will be focusing on mainly. So let's first kind of break down what ADHD means. Even though it's frequently talked about, when I ask people, even some people who say that they have it, they seem to have a hard time articulating what part of their experience actually we call ADHD, and what is it that what are the most common symptoms or types of ADHD. So typically we can say that there are three types. Most people are always the combined type. That goes, I think, for most things. It's kind of like picking. It can be focused, it can be automatic, but most people have both, right? The question is just what is predominant. But the two main clusters of symptoms, maybe that's a better way of putting it, are grouped in these two categories. One is the inattentive type. So when your problems don't deal with hyperactivity, but more with the inability to direct your attention where you want it to be. And then the second type is hyperactive or impulsive type. We will break this down even further, and then I will show you what symptoms are characteristic of both, and maybe we'll comment a little bit about the symptom list. So let's start with the inattentive type. So here are some, just pay attention. I would caution you to pay attention to how these are phrased. I think a lot of people, so here's my first in probably a line of many digressions, but people frequently think of not just ADHD, but in general of these DSM categories as if there are some real entities that exist in the way in which, I don't know, diabetes exists. What we usually call a diagnosis, it's just a cluster, a combination of symptoms. So you're supposed to have a certain number of these symptoms, and they're supposed to last at least 6 months or more. And they're supposed to be present in two different contexts. So let's say home and work, or school and home, depending on your age. So a lot of these, so don't take this as being as a sign that, sorry, this is my Bluetooth speakers turning themselves off. Just, think of this as a label that we put on different patterns of thinking, acting, and behaving. Don't think of it as this actual entity that exists. So here's what characterizes the inattentive type. Poor listening skills. So perhaps people are telling you something, perhaps you're listening to me right now, and then your attention wanders to something else, and then you come back, and then you find that I'm saying something like this, that people have poor listening skills, but because your attention went elsewhere for a while, you're not sure who are these people that I'm talking about. So that would be poor listening skills. This can frequently cause, let's say, misunderstandings and sometimes perhaps problems in interpersonal relationships, because people tend to perceive those who have poor listening skills as being uninterested, or even a bit aloof, because they just don't seem all that present. It's actually not that necessarily a person doesn't care. It's just that keeping their focus on one thing for a long time is exhausting, and that includes listening. So that's why we say poor listening skills, because it's hard to direct your attention to what people are saying all the time. Then tendency to lose or misplace items. Think about it. Let's try and just logically deduce these symptoms from the idea that inattentive type has obviously problems keeping attention on one object. So if your mind is scattered, when your attention goes from one place to another and then to another and then to another, you are more likely to misplace items. You might be seen as being forgetful in that respect, but this is not because you have memory issues. It's because your focus jumps around and then it doesn't stay long enough on one task so that you actually memorize it or figure out what you did. Just to give you an example, I have a friend and I suspect that he has ADD, so the inattentive type. He's not hyperactive, but he does have severe attention problems. And when he came to visit like a couple of months back, I went into the kitchen. I had during my lunch break, and all my friends visit me so that they can spend their days on the beach, because that's just what they do. And so I found his headphones, earbuds, sorry, one next to the coffee machine and the other one where I keep spices, like on a shelf with the spices. And so I had no idea what they were doing there, and I just left them there because I thought, he must have a reason why he left them there. And then the next morning, before he went to the beach, he said, "Oh, can you please help me and let me borrow your earbuds because I lost mine. I think I left them on the beach." And I said, "No, one is just next to the coffee machine, and the other one is mixed in with the spices." Somehow, when he was walking through the house, getting ready to go to the beach, one earbud ended up there, the other one there. How that happened, he has no idea. I have no explanation for it whatsoever, because they have a box, where they usually are. But that's what it is. So he does that all the time. And sometimes he loses things, like he lost his ID, I don't know how many times. And it's not that he doesn't care. It's just that his attention is so unstable that he really doesn't keep it. He's just not present. It's kind of a state of being carried by the content that goes through your head instead of being present wherever you are. They're easily sidetracked by external and unimportant stimuli. So there's some difficulty in discerning what is important, what isn't, right? They tend to forget their daily activities. They have a diminished attention span, but I think that sort of goes without saying, considering what I listed before. Inattentive type is also characterized by the lack of ability to follow instructions. So even if you tell a person something that is very simple, like 1, 2, 3, 4, and you know that they're obviously smart enough to follow the instructions, they somehow manage to forget or skip the steps or mix them up. They lack the ability to follow instructions. So sorry, I just read the whole thing again. So I meant to say they avoid activities that require concentration. And just in the right time, I showed that apparently my focus isn't all that I thought it was today. So they avoid activities that require concentration. And this avoidance pattern is not something that, this is one place, for example, where you can immediately see how ADD or ADHD can feed into skin picking, because skin picking also tends to be very heavily related to avoiding emotions or thoughts or feelings or those tasks that might induce anxiety or threat or stress. So they have this avoidant component in common. And then there's failure to focus that results in making thoughtless mistakes, which I think kind of goes from everything else that I've said. That would be the first type, the inattentive type. The second type is hyperactive or impulsive type. I think when you think of a kind of stereotypical representation of ADHD, I think this is what people mostly refer to. Because a person who has attention deficit disorder, so without the hyperactive, without the H, just the inattentive type, you might not, it might not be as easy to notice or diagnose, whereas the hyperactive or impulsive type is much easier to notice. So a person that has the hyperactive or impulsive type will tend to fidget or squirm, and they're always kind of restless, always ready to get up and go and move and do something. Usually people will say, I can't sit still. It makes them extremely anxious and kind of makes their bodies very agitated. They lack the ability to play or engage quietly. Especially, this refers to children, of course, but I think it also refers to adults, because sometimes they might have these like loud outbursts that might seem socially inappropriate. They're incapable of staying seated in class or at work. So they have to get up from their desk like 10 times during their workday. Otherwise, they can't focus. They tend to be very talkative. And when they talk to other people, they have difficulties waiting for their turn. So the inattentive type might just, mentally exit the conversation and not interrupt. But with the hyperactive or impulsive type, they might not actually finish your sentence before they say theirs. Or sometimes what I've noticed is that you will say something and then their response will be something completely different, because in the meantime, as you were talking, their brains already started processing what you were saying, and they remembered something that feels very important to share. And because they have problems controlling their impulses, then they'll just ignore everything you said and just say what's on their mind, right? So they have difficulties kind of following the conversation, or kind of securing a normal flow of the conversation. They tend to interrupt activities of other people or just intrude into conversations. They impulsively blurt out answers before questions are even completely asked. This is obviously quite common. And the reason why I said that that I wouldn't consider this, that obviously this is an actual issue, and sometimes it can be very, very difficult to cope with. The reason why I said that you shouldn't treat any of the DSM-5 categories as anything but these abstract categories is because, as I'm reading this, for example, I wonder, how come as a child I wasn't diagnosed with having ADHD? Because even now I'm very hard to shut up. So I used to interrupt people all the time. Um, I was, kind of a very energetic child. My brain would work very, very quickly, and then sometimes I would frequently actually interrupt people before they ask questions. And even in the previous one with the inattentive type, I could see not now, but when I was young and even into my high school days, I could see myself in many of these categories. Um, uh, Except that I would never say that the stimuli that would distract me would be unimportant. I would say that they would be more interesting at the time. And not to mention my sister. When I look at this, it's basically a profile of her as a child. I think this is what I meant. It's that, so it's something that I obviously grew out of with no medication or treatment whatsoever. But I think maybe it has to do with the fact that I had a very supportive environment and parents that actually had time and patience to deal with me the way I was. So technically speaking, this is why I'm what I was saying about kind of who gets diagnosed. For example, I read one biography of Picasso's like a while back, and he also appeared to have been very hyperactive. He was a horrible student and was not even considered to be that intelligent at all, because he just wasn't able to focus on schoolwork. On the other hand, if you look at his artwork from that period, you can clearly see that you have a genius on your hand. So I think a lot of how we frame these diagnostic criteria, not just for ADHD, but while I'm at it, for it maybe especially, has to do with the expectations that the educational system has, with the time that parents have to spend with their children and their energy and the cultural environment. So there are many factors that have to be taken into account. I always kind of feel bad when people think that just because their experience can be described with one or more of these labels, that somehow makes them wrong or broken, because it really doesn't. It's just a different way of functioning that doesn't seem to be aligned with a lot of what culture expects from us. On the other hand, as I mentioned, Picasso, even his art wasn't aligned with what culture expected, and he's one of the great artists, perhaps not just of the 20th century, but of all times. So, you can say what you will about him, but it pretty much, he had his own, he was beating to the sound of his own drum, and it was worth it. One thing that I'm going to do now is show you how inattention, hyperactivity, and impulsivity can all lead to picking in similar but not identical ways. So when you have problems with attention, so I wrote here inattention, but what we're actually talking about is when attention is hypervigilant. So it's scattered all over the place. It keeps jumping from one object to another. In interpersonal relations, this can lead to a lot of negative feedback. I already mentioned that people have a hard time relating to someone that is hard to have a conversation with, right? So that can lead to a lot of invalidation. It can also lead to a lot of frustration as well, because you want to do well in school, but it's very hard, or at work, but it's very hard to keep your focus on one thing for long enough. Just having to redirect your focus over and over and over again, to one thing, and having your concentration escape and move on to something else, can be very anxiety inducing. So one of the I should probably have mentioned this. In order to be diagnosed with ADHD, you also have to exclude other conditions. So physical conditions, but also some psychological and psychiatric conditions, anxiety disorders included. And this is precisely because anxiety, when it gets extreme, can also really worsen our attention and cause almost identical symptoms. And so when it comes to ADHD, it can sometimes be, anxiety can be mistaken for it, but at the same time, ADHD typically tends to make those who struggle with it anxious, because it is a frustrating thing to be in a world that requires you to focus when this is so difficult and out of reach for you. I think how pronounced this issue is depends on the kind of work a person does, or the kind of school they go to, or the kind of working environment or family environment that they have. Because they can provide a lot of, like, the social feedback that we get is what causes people to feel anxious, because that's where we get our expectations from. What we expect from ourselves, we learn from how other people react to us. So that's how we learn what's good and what's bad, right? And so when you get invalidated by others because it's very difficult for you to focus on long conversations or long meetings, or because you get a lower grade than someone else because you can't sit and study all day, right? That leads to a lot of invalidation, that leads to a lot of anxiety. And then all this reflects on how, rather, our bodies react to all these things. So what happens is that your body becomes agitated or excited in some way. And when this agitation of the body becomes very intense or lasts for a very long time, you need some sort of a relief, something that will bring your body back to its equilibrium, something that will get all that energy that accumulates out of your body. That is usually kind of understood as the urge to pick, that need to eliminate that agitation, and then that leads to picking. So we cannot say that a person like this has necessarily an anxiety disorder, but here you can clearly see how a symptom of ADHD, so inattention, leads to picking because of how we relate to other people and how we're sometimes unable to satisfy the expectations that even we have from ourselves. The second one is hyperactivity. I think this one should be very obvious and it's very easy to test. All you have to do is try and sit down, take a timer. You can use the one on your phone, set it to 5 minutes, sit on your hands or put your hands on your lap and just wait until those 5 minutes are up. Just sit and do not move under any conditions. And if you have ADHD, it's very likely that this will make you extremely restless. It will make you restless, and that will also lead to bodily arousal, except that it is a little bit different than the anxiety that I was describing. What you might feel here is this kind of unbearable need to move or to walk. Sometimes that's located in your legs or in your feet. Sometimes it's located in your hands. And picking, especially when it's located in your hands, my clients will usually describe that they have to do something with their hands, and it has to be something that is repetitive because there's a lot of restlessness in their hands. So that also is bodily arousal, just not anxiety. And that also can be understood as the urge to pick. Or if you walk around feeling that restlessness, at some point you get overwhelmed by it, and then that goes and becomes the urge to pick, and then obviously leads to picking. And the third one is impulsivity. So when you're impulsive, I didn't put impulsivity here, but the scale is almost the same, except that there's an additional component here, which is that impulsivity means that we're having a hard time resisting to react to what we feel or what we think. So when impulsivity doesn't mean that you're actually doing something terribly, unusual, unacceptable. It just means that between feeling something and acting on something, there's very, very little space. So you feel something and then you immediately act. Whereas someone who is not impulsive, they go through a different process. They will pay attention to what they feel, then they will consider their options. So I can do A, B, C, D, E, or whatever. And then they will slowly reduce their options to 1 or 2, and then just choose one and do it. This is a process that happens rather quickly. But when the person is impulsive, they skip that stage of thinking and immediately go to what is habitual or what is the first thing that comes to their mind. So they lack this part that in constructivism we call circumspection, when you consider all the possible avenues of acting that you have. So when it comes to impulsivity and the way it leads to picking, it's not just that it leads to bodily arousal. It's that the thought about picking would be enough to immediately proceed with picking. So it's a very quick mechanism. So there's no thinking, there's no considering of other options. There's just a sensation which can last for a millisecond, and then you jump immediately into picking, trying to resolve it. This is, I hope that it's easy for you to see how, for example, inattention and even hyperactivity to a certain degree could be more focused, or at least hyperactivity is 50-50, whereas impulsivity tends to lead to more automatic picking. So it can happen in front of other people as well, because you lack that period where you consider your options, the context, the situation you're in, that is lacking when you're impulsive. So it's quite literally the opposite of patience. So when impulsivity as a part of ADHD causes it, it's usually automatic picking. So what does this mean for the treatment of skin picking? To me, this is quite important, because all of these listed here is something that I see quite frequently with people who have ADHD. First of all, there's the issue with compliance. If you remember, I mentioned that the inattentive type especially has problems following through with simple steps or instructions. They have problems keeping routines. So therefore, it might happen that they forget their session time, or that in skin pick, because it's done in writing, they will forget to log in, forget to respond. They will read my responses, then forget that they've read them, and then obviously that causes issues with compliance. They tend to miss live sessions as well. They tend to forget assignments. They don't persist enough with assignments. Because people with ADHD really get a lot of invalidation from their environment, they don't tend to be very confident. So one failure with a technique might be seen as, let's just give this whole thing up and not try this technique ever again. So they might do something that we agree that they will do. They might do it once, but they will not do it every day. Sometimes they might stop in the middle. Sometimes they might have the intention to do it, but then they get distracted by what diagnostic criteria say are unimportant stimuli, right? And then they don't come back to the assignment. None of this is because they don't want help. None of this is because they don't care to do the assignments. It's simply a feature of ADHD. This leads frequently to them feeling very, very discouraged and then dropping out. And if they're impulsive, between feeling discouraged and dropping out, there's about 5 milliseconds of time. When impulsivity is not that pronounced, usually what we do is we discuss this, we adjust the program, adjust how therapy is done. We find a way to simplify things, to make it easier to apply. But it does require patience, both on the part of the therapist, but more importantly, on the part of the client. So it's not just that ADHD can exacerbate skin picking. It's also that the nature of ADHD or the diagnosis as it is defined now makes treatment more difficult. Luckily, both skin picking and ADHD intersect in one, let's say, approach to treatment. So that's mindfulness, mindfulness-based interventions in general. As part of acceptance and commitment therapy, we use mindfulness in treatment. And I will usually ask my clients to actually start a formal meditation practice, or at least most of them, because not everyone wants to do it. The reason why I'm putting this here is because this is where both treatment for, at least non-medical treatment for non-pharmaceutical treatment of ADHD and skin picking intersect. So what you see on the right here is a meta-analysis of how mindfulness-based interventions affect symptoms of ADHD. So 11 studies were included here with a total of 682 participants. And the conclusion of this meta-analysis is that mindfulness-based interventions will reduce inattention, which kind of makes sense because the basic two things that you learn to control and balance in meditation is attention and awareness. So meditation is essentially the interplay between these two. So what you learn, what the basic problem with ADHD is, which is that you learn how to consciously direct your attention to an object and then keep it there for longer periods of time. And this is theoretically the case. And as this meta-analysis shows, studies also confirm that it can reduce inattention, but also hyperactivity and impulsivity. One of the reasons for this, the latter two, especially the last one, is that we know from studies that would look at brain changes on MRI scans of people who meditate when they start versus 8 or 10 weeks later, what we see is that there is a slight thickening of a part of prefrontal cortex. So and also connections between prefrontal cortex and the limbic system become stronger. And this means that you have more conscious control over your behavior. So meditation lowers your impulsivity. On the level of, if you've ever practiced meditation, how that looks like when you actually do it, it's that in meditation, what you're essentially doing is you're losing your focus and then bringing it back to whatever the object of meditation is, your breath, your body, a phrase. There are many types of meditations, but they all do the same. You get distracted, you come back. You get distracted, you come back. So by doing this, you learn how to not be frustrated when your attention wanders away. You learn how to notice, how to observe when your attention is wandering, and then gently return it back to the breath. So that part of meditation, the perpetual returning to the breath when you get lost, is what actually helps with ADHD. And the effects, according to this study, so it's from 2019. I didn't find a newer meta-analysis, and I wanted to present something more comprehensive, so I went with this one. It says that effects of meditation, regular meditation, are moderate or high. So it's quite effective. Becoming less impulsive is also extremely beneficial for treating skin picking as well, because one of the things about the urge when it becomes very strong is that you lose conscious control over your behavior and you just impulsively jump into picking, because that is how you interpret the urge. You interpret that as, I have to pick, and then you at some point just jump into it. And when you reduce impulsivity and become more patient through your meditation practice, then you're more likely to be able to resist the urge. And then, of course, another thing where they meet is hyperactivity and intense urge to pick. Meditation deals with both of these, or mindfulness specifically. I can't speak for every form of meditation, but mindfulness meditation deals with both of these by actually increasing our ability to observe and be non-reactive. If you've ever tried mindfulness, you know that there's that kind of coming back to the breath part. And then there's another thing, which is where when you find yourself distracted or lost in thoughts, you have to let go and then go back to the breath. But when you let go of a thought or a feeling, it doesn't mean that they disappear and go away. In fact, what happens is that they will sometimes continue to linger in your awareness for a couple of more seconds or minutes, depending on what the content of the thought is. And you learn to just have it there in your awareness without feeling the need to actually do anything about it. And when you have that power, then you can also feel the urge and decide not to act on it. And then you can also feel this need to get up and walk and be, feeling restlessness, or like you have too much energy. And then you can allow that energy to simply be and come and go at its own, pace and with its own volition. And you will not feel the need to react to it. So this is how mindfulness helps with both skin picking and ADHD. Unfortunately, we don't have a meta-analysis that is similar to this that talks specifically about mindfulness-based interventions and skin picking, but we know that acceptance and commitment therapy works for skin picking. So this has been empirically validated time and time again. And one of the major components, if not the main component there, is to mindfully approach your experience to eliminate what we call experiential avoidance. So in that sense, cultivating mindfulness through formal practice deals with both of these at the same time. I will say from a clinical point of view, so these are the studies that are done. Studies are usually done on kind of almost perfectly selected subjects. And so you can't always generalize their findings or think that they will translate into clinical work. But what the problem is sometimes, it's that if you start meditating and then you start with, let's say, a 15-minute meditation, or you don't use guided meditations, or you use guided meditations that are just too long or include long periods of silence, it can be extremely frustrating for someone who has ADHD. So the key there is to start with short practices, even less than 5 minutes sometimes, and then do them several times during the day, and then slowly increase the duration, because you don't want to cause more frustration, because that will lead to more anxiety, more anger, more stress, and then therefore more picking. Now, I would like to add something about medication as well, because I think this is a very important topic. There are no studies, at least not any that are known to me, about the effects of medication on skin picking. There are some case reports. So I have screenshots here of case reports that you can find on PubMed. And so look at the titles, and then you will see why I think this is an important subject and why I think it should be researched more. So the first case report here from 2019 says cessation of skin picking symptoms with methylphenidate, that's Adderall treatment, in a child with comorbid skin picking and attention deficit hyperactivity disorder. So in this case, when the child was treated with methylphenidate, they stopped picking as well, and it improved their attention. And then the second case report says newly developed skin picking after methylphenidate treatment in ADHD, possible mechanisms. So they explore what could have caused it. So one case report tells you that someone stopped picking after they got treatment for ADHD. And then the other case report tells you that someone actually began picking once they started treatment for ADHD. This third study here is an overview of different medical treatments that are being tested or tried out or available for skin picking. Spoiler alert, none of these were approved by the FDA, so it's all off-label prescribing, and none of them are as effective as psychotherapy is, but it's nonetheless a very useful paper, at least in my opinion. And this paper also mentions that actually, I'm going to read you the quote because I put it here. So this quote, the third line here, it says, furthermore, other possibly useful substances like methylphenidate and atomoxetine, which is also, it was originally registered, it is actually an antidepressant, but it is efficient also in treating ADHD. It said they were shown to be both useful in few patients with comorbid ADHD and skin picking or trichotillomania, respectively, as well as to be associated with the onset of skin picking or with trichotillomania, will have to be carefully assessed in rigorous trials. And then they say the following, which is a rare candid moment in a scientific paper. It says, we hate concluding further studies are needed to address whether, but in this case, it is highly appropriate. And I have to say that I completely agree with them. I have seen both of these situations, that someone starts treatment for ADHD and that significantly improves their picking. And I have seen situations where people start treatment for ADHD, both adults, adolescents, and kids, and then it exacerbates or actually starts skin picking. The trouble there, of course, is that ADHD really creates a lot of issue in terms of how a person can function among, with other people, and then it causes problems, and then they cannot stop the ADHD treatment, but at the same time they also don't know what to do with picking. So there's always like a balancing act, a trade-off that has to happen. What I've noticed, so I've noticed all these cases, and I have really tried to find a pattern. I'm the kind of a person that really likes looking for patterns, but I really have not been able to assemble, let's say, a tentative profile, like who will react in what way. And this truly deserves a lot more research. Not so much, I think, certainly for us to know who should get what kind of treatment for ADHD, but also so that we can learn more about skin picking, because it tells you maybe not that there are two different types or two different sets of causes of skin picking, but certainly if some people, if everyone takes the same substance, some people lose their symptoms, others gain them or have them be more intense. There are obviously two different mechanisms at play in our minds, in our brains, in this case. So I think this would be really very important for us to learn. But unfortunately, I'm not a researcher, so I cannot command people to do studies. If you know of any studies that actually do, I really did try to find them, not just now, but before as well. I would love to hear what you found and what you have. What I've noticed though is when we don't have either of these extreme cases, I've noticed that there is a tendency for picking to worsen when drug effects are wearing off. So if you're using Adderall and you take it in the morning, sometimes it happens that that picking might be worse in the evening or very early in the morning before you actually take Adderall. So those would be people who are helped to an extent by Adderall, but not completely. So those early mornings and late evenings are parts of the day. If you have ADHD and if you take medication, those two parts of your day are specifically important to be mindful of so that you can prevent picking. Uh, Sometimes stimulus control techniques help for this. So that's something to consider. So this is all that I had for you. I will now, first of all, I have to, as always, thank SkinPick for allowing us to meet. Now we will close the poll and then move on to the Q&A. Also, if you're interested in joining the program, as always, in the next 7 days, we're offering a $100 discount for the first month. So you have that as well. Let me close the poll. If only this button would work. Oh, there it is. So, oh, this is a landslide victory. Half of you have voted for the next webinar in January to be skin picking and OCD, and I'm quite looking forward to this one because we will have some neuroscience to present. We will have clinical information that is really important. So I'm really looking forward to this. This is an important topic, and I'm happy to announce that some material actually exists. So in January, we will be talking about OCD and skin picking. And now I will stop the recording and go to your questions.